Hi everybody, thanks for coming back to the channel. This is going to be another episode of the Missing Few saga that we've been talking about now for some weeks. And it is a saga and it is a problem. It's an emotive issue, a complex issue with lots of points of view, lots of different aspects of the law involved and morality and all kinds of things. And we've tried to deal with this almost like writing a book. I did write a book about it many years ago, Missing in Action, Resting in Peace, which was a chronology of the whole thing, which set it out quite clearly about how the problem arose of pilots shot down and missing during the Battle of Britain, not recovered at the time, and only recovered many years after the war. The Ministry of Defence's stance being not a proactive one, but letting sleeping dogs lie, as it were, even if families want the remains recovered. So the whole thing's very complicated, and rather than try and recap everything on every episode, please go back to the first episode, which actually does explain all of those things and how this matter arose. And then the other episodes look at the various recoveries along the way, until the episode previous to this one is about the Protection of Military Remains Act, which came in 1986 to restrict and regulate this activity with the weight of the law behind it. So that's very important. It's quite dry, I suppose, when you look at a statute and you have to try and explain the offences involved and the rationale behind that and the penalties. But it's all important background to where we're going now. And what I want to look at today are 3 or 4 recoveries that happened after the Protection of Military Remains Act. So let's start off with poor Sergeant Ernest Scott of Treble 2 Squadron, a Spitfire pilot. He was a successful, experienced fighter pilot. But on the 27th of September 1940, that was a day of heavy losses for Fighter Command, after a period of time where the losses had actually been much reduced. And on that particular day, the German fighters definitely held sway. They came in by their hundreds, and they came in very high up. So often caught air squadrons off guard, on the climb, above cloud, where they stood out like a sore thumb. And down come the 109s. It's a classic ambush scenario. And on this particular day, Treble 2 Squadron lost Sergeant Scott, who without a doubt was shot down by none other than the father of modern air fighting himself, namely Major Werner Melders, the Commodore of Jagerschwader 51. So it's a classic case, really, of a bounce. And he's shot down over Kent, and a Spitfire was reported down at Hollingbourne, where number 49 maintenance unit that was very active in that area investigating these sites at the time discovered a piece of Spitfire which confirmed it to be P9364, which was Sergeant Scott's Spitfire. However, for whatever reason, Sergeant Scott himself was not recovered at the time. And you could appreciate the angst that this has caused his family. And his father even wrote to Churchill himself, imploring that every effort should be made to find missing airmen. And the Prime Minister wrote back assuring Mr. Scott that that would be the case. But still, he remained missing, and was amongst those many, many thousands of names recorded on the Runnymede Memorial to the missing. So it's a sad situation. But in 1977, Steve Vizard, who was 19 at the time, but very active in the area of aviation archaeology, which was still a fairly new activity in those days, he relocated the site, but having no contact with the Scott family at the time, didn't pursue a recovery, which was the right decision, he still believes, and so do I. And then there it all stayed until the Protection of Military Remains Act came in 1986. Now, when that happened, there was a flurry of activity, which we've had a look at in the penultimate episode to this one. Just before the Act came in, there were several recoveries. But once the Act came in, obviously nobody knew how the MOD would react to an infringement of the Act. So people were quite cautious for a while. And in this case, young Mark Kirby went with an enthusiast friend who was in touch with Sergeant Scott's brother, Albert, and took Albert to the crash site, who was obviously deeply moved to see where not only his brother died, but where undoubtedly his brother remained. And the landowner gave permission for a recovery, but then changed his mind and would not be moved, even despite the family imploring him to allow a recovery to take place. So that was all very sad. But then the pilot's sister, Mrs. Irene Hopkins, petitioned the then Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, and His Royal Highness then contacted the MOD and asked them to look into the matter, which the ministry did. And clearly there was no justification for the fact that Sergeant Scott was not recovered in 1940. And this then led to RAF Support Command's Crash and Smash, as it's called, being tasked with excavating the Spitfire's crash site, which happened, and recovered Sergeant Scott, who then received a military funeral at RAF Manston and was buried in the station plot at nearby Margate Cemetery. So all of that saga led to one of the few being brought in from the cold again. So that was interesting because it involved family support and it involved a member of the royal family. So then let's go on to the next involvement, which was, so the Scott recovery took place 15th of December 1990. The next one is Sergeant John Ellis of 85 Squadron, a Hurricane pilot, who was recovered in September 1993. Now Ellis had been shot down on the 1st of September 1940 when 85 Squadron, 79 Squadron and 253 Squadron were in action against 109s from JG-26, Adolf Gallen's a very famous unit over Kent, and a number of pilots were wounded or killed. And Sergeant Ellis was missing, simply missing. Nothing was heard of him again as such. But evidence would confirm to a point that his were the remains of an airman buried as unknown at St. Mary Cray Cemetery in Orpington. So there's then a convoluted story about the post-war rediscovery of this Hurricane's crash site by various groups and so on, and then, which was near Sevenoaks, and then in 1992, Mark Kirby, who feels incredibly strongly, as do I and others, about the fact that it is completely wrong for these pilots to be left out there if there's any chance of recovering them. And Mark went ahead, relocated the site, and feeling as strongly as he did, undertook an unauthorised recovery in 1993, during which human remains were discovered and handed over to police. Now, these remains were obviously left in situ, for whatever reason, by the original recovery gang. So it was a strange situation with probably the majority of the pilot having already been buried as unknown, and now these other remains being found, which were confirmed to be Sergeant Ellis. And these were handed over to the police, who were sympathetic, and Mark was not arrested under the Protection of Military Remains Act, and nor did the Ministry of Defence take any other action, which certainly surprised Mark and indeed puzzled everyone else involved at the time. So was the Protection of Military Remains Act then a paper tiger? and nothing more. Did it have no teeth? Well, not surprisingly, when you feel so strongly about something, there's yet another pilot in Kent. In fact, there are still several more, which we'll talk about as these episodes proceed. But Sergeant John Gilders is next on the list. 41 Squadron at Hornchurch, another successful fighter pilot, survived the Battle of Britain, but on the 21st of February 1940, Squadron Leader Johnny Hill, who I knew well, lovely man, was leading the squadron on patrol of the northeast Kent coast, and at 32,000 feet, John Gilders was seen to inexplicably drop out of formation and fail to answer any messages on the RT, on the radio telephone. And it's highly likely that what's happened is his oxygen system has failed and he's become unconscious, and unfortunately has not recovered consciousness as pilots sometimes did, to recover his aircraft before it crashed. And there it was. It crashed, Spitfire P7816 at Chilham Beaches, hard by the River Stour. So good old 49 MU are back there again to investigate the site, and they recover various items that are identified not only just as Spitfire, but as Sergeant Gilders' specific aircraft, P7816. But again, Sergeant Gilders was not recovered, and this was dreadfully distressing for the family, especially when they subsequently receive a communication from the Air Ministry to say that John's body is at RAF Hawkinge, when it wasn't. It was without a doubt another 41 Squadron pilot. They suffered 2 more casualties in action, actually. And it was one of those. So how distressing can that be? So there we are. In 1970, the London Air Museum, the former London Air Museum, located and excavated the crash site at Chilham Beaches, recovering various items, but were unable to recover a large piece of wreckage that was located quite deep down. So there the matter was left until 20th of April 1994, having made contact with the family and having the family's full support, Mark Kirby and friends undertook another unauthorised recovery and indeed recovered John Gilders' human remains. Now, unlike the previous case of Sergeant Ellis, Mark was arrested on this occasion under the provisions of POMRA and charged, and subsequently pleaded guilty, represented by his solicitor John Tickner, who'd been involved himself in aviation archaeology, pleaded guilty with mitigation at Ashford Magistrate, and the mitigation was not, as people often believe, that the family required a recovery which the MOD would not pursue. It wasn't that at all. It was because the 49 MU report was discredited about the fact that they have made no effort to recover the pilot's remains, when it was pretty obvious that he was down in that hole. So Mark received a conditional discharge, or absolute discharge, and what that actually is, it is a conviction. So although you don't receive a punishment directly, you've still got a criminal record. It's still a conviction. So what it does show is that the court were probably bewildered by the whole thing, as most reasonable people would be, as to why the MOD allowed this situation to develop and still happen. And the court was clearly sympathetic to what Mark had gone and achieved. And what he'd achieved was to bring Gilders in from the cold, who was also given a full military funeral at long last and put to rest at Brookwood, much, of course, to the delight of his family. So that was Gilders, and it was a very high-profile case. But even that wasn't the end of it, because Sergeant Stanislaw Duszinski of 238 Squadron was missing in Kent on Romney Marsh. Again, a long convoluted story. It's all in the book. I interviewed loads of people who've been involved in it, and the book came out, well, 1998. It's not in print anymore, so if you can get a book, it's secondhand. It's not a sales plug for me, but it's still a useful document with the chronology. And I often refer to it, as indeed does the Ministry of Defence. So the Duszinski recovery also went ahead unauthorised, but stopped because the landowner wasn't happy. And it's probably a good thing, because as John Tickner says, after the Gilders recovery, things would probably have not gone well for us if it had ended up in court. So it's a particularly difficult site on Romney Marsh, being so, as the name suggests, marshy, and the wreckage is very deep down. So unfortunately, Sergeant Duszinski defied being recovered, and he remains missing. So that's where we are now, up to 1996. But there was a more successful recovery in 1996, and that was an official recovery of Sergeant Dennis Noble, so a 43 Squadron based at Tangmere. But we'll look at that in the next episode, in which we'll also look at who else is out there, who remains missing. Are there really Battle of Britain pilots still buried with the wreckage of their aircraft in Kent and known to be there? Is that the case? Is that true? Well, yes, it is. So we're going to look at that, and then probably after that episode, I'm very pleased that Group Captain Clive Montelier has agreed to come in. Clive's retired now, but from the Air Force, but he's the head of the Joint Compassionate Casualty Clearing Centre at RAF Innsworth in Gloucestershire, not a million miles away from where I'm speaking to you now. To give the MOD view. It's not a witch hunt. I want to hear. You can't hold people responsible for things that happened before they were in post. But it's interesting to know what the MOD's take on all this is today. So Clive will be in to do that. And then Steve Vizard, the man himself, is going to come into the studio and probably give us a completely bipolar view, I imagine. And I would think both sessions will be pretty lively. So we've not finished with this by any means, and when we finish the Battle of Britain side of it, I'm going to do one episode which is going to talk about the wider context of recovering the missing from the Second World War, which I started a PhD about some years ago, and that is very interesting, I can assure you. So thanks for listening. I hope it's food for thought. Join the conversation. Any comments below, please join the conversation. I'm always interested in feedback and what people think. And if you like what we do, you can watch for free. Just sign up, and if you subscribe, you'll get notifications when the videos and podcasts come out. We do try and release a video or a podcast every Sunday morning. So, join our community, and let's talk Battle of Britain. So thanks for listening. I hope it's really made you think. If you're just catching up with us, please go back and start watching the other episodes about the missing few, and I think we've got over 80 videos and podcasts now on the channel, so there's plenty to get stuck into there, and I'll look forward to talking to you all next time. So thanks very much.